Throughout this series, we've repeatedly heard that ambitious EU and national policies backed by effective implementation plans are key to driving the large-scale change that's needed for us to decarbonise and achieve energy security. We rely upon policymakers to look beyond what we can see as individuals to protect us from the threats ahead and deliver societal improvements that will enhance the quality of all our lives. But long-term gain generally necessitates short-term pain, with national investment in the future drawing criticism for not focusing on the here and now. So how do politicians think big while balancing the pain points that affect their constituents today? Must we look towards EU policymakers to ensure that our long-term direction of travel transcends governments? And if so, how are these policies formulated at a European level and then translated to appropriate implementation at a national level? To find out, I'm talking with Brian Leddin, who swapped his career as an engineer to become a Green Party TD and now sits as the chair of the Oireachtas Committee on Climate Change, and Tanya Harrington, former researcher at the European Commission and Ministerial Advisor, and now chair of Renewable Energy Ireland. I'm Paddy Finn, and this is the Electricity Exchange. Tanya, Brian, it's great to see you both. How are you keeping?
Really well, thank you. Really well.
Yeah, fantastic.
Brian, what are the key mechanisms that are driving this current phase of the transition? And Tanya, how through your work with REI are you building upon this to have more sectoral specific targets that are ultimately achievable?
So what the government has done, it's passed a climate act. We talked about the targets, and they're locked into the act. But what's also in there is the principle of carbon budgets. So this is a self-imposed ration on the amount of carbon we will emit in the next 5 years. And we've set also a carbon budget for the 5 years after that, and a provisional one for the 5 years after that as well. And then with those carbon budgets, those 5-year carbon rations, we'll say, those are each going to be subdivided into what are called sectoral emission ceilings. So whether it's agriculture, transport, electricity, industry, heating, these will all have their own ration within the broader 5-year carbon budget.
So as chair of Renewable Energy Ireland, I have the privilege of trying to amplify the key messages from the clean energy technology trade associations. So the board is comprised of the CEOs of each of those, which Paddy's DRAI is a member. So one of the things that's really clear is, and one of the things we're working towards now, is a kind of a communications tool kit that all of those trade associations can use, which says our policy framework is very clear, right? So we have the EU legislative framework, which has been transposed into domestic law. We have the Climate Act, we have the Climate Action Plan, we have the carbon budgets, and now we're going to have sectoral budgets to support those. There are some gaps which I think are around a demand policy, and I think maybe even hydrogen. We don't have a state hydrogen policy. But one of the things through REI I think is really important to do is to say, take those carbon budgets, look at the amount of carbon. I almost see it like a rubber, like I have to rub out all of this shading. I have to rub out, and I bring it back to the carbon budgets from 2025 to 30, and from now to 2025. We're already in 22, so we only have 3 years, 36 months. What do I need to do this month and next month in terms of market constraints, structural issues, regulatory barriers, funding? What are the things, planning, grid? So what we're doing in REI is we're specifying the actions that need to be taken to decarbonise in line with the carbon budgets across electricity, heat, transport. And we're also going to amplify the messaging around the enabling pieces like grid and having a flexible, robust grid, and route to market and planning system. And we do that as an effort to contribute to the decision-making processes that are there, to bring the expertise around the table and to act as a voice for the clean energy sector, renewable sector in Ireland.
And Tanya, your background is policy, regulation and governance, which is a set of skills that could be applied in a lot of areas. But your focus has been on decarbonisation, energy security for years now. Can you take us through the why?
Well, the why, I suppose, if I was to go back to the very beginning, I'm a historian at heart, actually. So I love sort of looking at things over a long perspective of time. And through my study in history, I was really interested in statecraft. And of course, public policy is strategy for states. And my first sort of foray into that was into security and defence policy. So I actually worked on the emerging common foreign security policy architecture in Europe as an intern in the European Commission. But security and defence, no less 25 years ago than today, energy policy is very closely aligned to that. And I suppose I pursued that interest in various roles, working either into government or inside government as an advisor. I was very proud to serve as a ministerial advisor with Noel Dempsey, and we produced Ireland's first white paper in 27 years in 2007. It was the first time that we talked about structural reform to the market, in competition and sustainable energy goals in public policy terms. And so it initiated, I suppose, and built on a lot of the work that had come before it, but it initiated that real sharp focus, which was exactly where Europe was going. And so whether I've worked in public or private companies, in academia or think tanks, I've chosen to stay very close to energy and climate policies because I believe it's intrinsic to how we secure our future for Ireland, but also for the European Union. And it's linked to kind of peace and stability, again, within the European Union, but also within Ireland. And so I was also had the privilege to work on the legislation that established the single energy market on the island of Ireland. And I later went on to do my PhD research in sort of securing the institutional and governance arrangements for that particular market. I've worked across economically regulated markets, a number of them, so communications, postal, broadcasting. So it's many of the principles around economic regulation which apply to multiple sectors. But my home and heart, if you like, is always energy and climate.
Brilliant. So for me, during this series, recording the series was hugely eye-opening to me. I thought I knew my job. I thought I knew my industry. And then I realized from the stakeholders I got to speak to, I feel like I've been living in a vacuum and I didn't actually realize all of this amazing messaging that's not out there. And so when we look at not only the benefits of decarbonisation, of energy security, when we look at all of the work, all the various facets of work that are going on, when we look at the impact of multiple sectors, I'm very focused on electricity. I mean, we look at basically the collage of the sectors that need to look towards all kinds of different solutions. It's been massively eye-opening, but there's been a common thread through it all, which is the need for effective policy and effective policy that's followed by effective implementation plans. But when we look at what's to be gained by success here, it's very considerable. So, you know, in the first episode, we spoke with Paul Dean and Paddy Finn, and in that we really uncovered for me, what was revealing was the benefits to the quality of people's lives that I don't think are apparent in the messaging. I wasn't getting this. And that, you know, if we look at, I think there's a real opportunity for almost like a Boris bus equivalent, but one with a very honest message, which is, look at all this money that we're sending out of the country for fossil fuels. Keep this in the country, grow industry here, reduce our cost of living, because energy feeds into everything. So energy isn't just our electricity, gas bills and our cost of diesel for our cars. Energy is the input to our food costs. It's the energy to our it's a feeds into our service sector and everything. So if we crack this, we become potentially an exporter. So we reduce the amount of money that's leaving the economy, increase what's coming in as an exporter, and the average person on the street has a higher quality of life and less stress. Because at the moment, if you look at those who can absorb the current increases in cost in energy, they're the lucky few. Those who can actually absorb the cost of retrofitting their houses to escape that increase, they're the even fewer. And so there's so much that can be achieved, a huge carrot there. But there's clearly challenges with getting there. And, you know, I spoke about that, the need for effective policy and in government. But a huge challenge must exist, Brian, when you are aware, your party are aware, the government is aware of what the potential benefits are here. But the result doesn't materialize straight away, and that there's nearer term pain points that people are having to deal with. And clearly that must almost create wedge issues arising any time that longer term objective seeks to be brought forward. How do you manage that? How do you deal with that in the world of politics? And perhaps there isn't a mechanism that fully deals with it, but how does that feed into your thinking in terms of how you bring forward what is in people's long-term best interest?
We're at the very start of this, and I think it remains to be seen how we do it. And I would say that if we're guilty of anything, it has been probably looking at the very high level, where we need to get to in, 10, 15, 20 years. And that's really important. And when we've set really, correct and proper strategic targets for reducing emissions and, and the various sub-targets as well. What politicians tend to do is they tend to treat those things that are quite abstract as, these are, of course, we'll reduce emissions by 51% in the next 8 years. Yeah, we'll tick that box. Of course, we'll go to net zero by 2050, easy. And then when you get down to actually the actions and the policies that give effect to those targets, you realize that, these things can be politicized very, very easily. And we've seen it in Ireland in the last couple of years of very simple projects, for example, cycle lanes or, I could even point down in my own county of Limerick, all the councillors down there decided to write to the Minister for Housing to get him to change the building regulations, to ask him to change the building regulations so that every new home would have a chimney stack, So the thinking at the policy level, at the lower level, the implementation level, isn't there at all yet, in my view. And I'm not answering your question particularly well because I don't know the answer to it. I think we still have to do it. It's something we've recognized as a committee that, everybody on the committee works very hard and they've broadly bought in, to the challenge that's there. And I think on the committee, at least, because everyone's very vested in it, they do understand that it's very hard. But our colleagues across all the parties, I'm not sure the penny has dropped for them. But it just remains to be seen, how we get to the implementation phase. And we've recognized as a committee, and we're going to do a whole series of sessions on communications. How do we explain to people where we need to go, why we need to go there, what needs to be done for us to get there? We're only at the very start of that. So we'll see.
And do you feel there's a lot to be done in terms of political process? So political process is key to actually turning an idea into reality through government. It's very important that politicians are seen not to exercise bias, to continue to represent all of their constituents as well as national objectives. So I'd imagine that are there alternative models to be looked towards, or is this where we need EU policy to be strong, and that this is where EU policy helps us to transcend governments? Because having spoken to the wind and solar sector, an interesting point there was that what we saw in the last decade, that the development of wind on the system really slowed down and tapered towards the end of the last decade, and particularly over the last 2 years. And because it had still been feeding off of the impact of the kind of 2007, 2008, Green Party in power. We had the all-island grid study, really ambitious targets set. And now we're at another cusp of another wave of this again, right? But we can't afford to have some sort of a 15-year cycle here and competing local and national objectives. So does European policy help us to transcend governments in that regard?
I might just kind of building on Brian's points there, I think I would draw a distinction between politics and policy, and between narrative and policy implementation. So politics is politics, and politics follows short cycles. And in democracies, politicians have to respond to the needs of their constituents. And that's a very difficult balancing act. They tend to represent broad churches, and large swathes of the economy that are at varying levels of socioeconomic advantage or disadvantage. So politics, I think, is almost, for me, in one respect, distinct, but obviously intertwined with policy development, which is agenda setting to solve particular public policy problems, setting the objectives, developing the legislation and the supporting regulation to implement that. And I would say at an EU and a domestic level, we have done that with extraordinary skill and ambition. And so every suite of legislative packages that have emerged from the EU are highly ambitious, very integrated. Some have very direct effect in Irish law, so they're regulations rather than directives. Some even are delegating acts. And I think, so if you ask me, is the legislative and regulatory architecture at EU level robust? I would say absolutely yes. And I think, in fact, we're meeting today at a point in time where we have a war in Europe that's affecting, obviously it's the largest humanitarian crisis since World War II, but we also have very significant impacts on energy, food and materials markets. And the EU's response to that is significant. So they've put out a very ambitious plan around our relationships with Russia and our relationships internally within our own energy markets and with our consumers. So repowering EU is really, for me, an extraordinary opportunity, a vector for change, and one that really offers a chance to pivot very quickly to the implementation of policy, which I'm coming to in the domestic sphere now, and renewable energy within that. And so if I take it then into the domestic sphere, what we've been very good at is producing plans and policy and reports and analysis and data, but it's in every policy sphere. It's not unique to energy or climate, but policy implementation is difficult because it's the point where the rubber hits the road, where somebody loses, somebody wins. And this is where a narrative becomes much more important. And you have to amplify political narrative while you're tackling the policy implementation issues. And for me, narrative, actually the war in Ukraine offers a kind of a sad but unique opportunity to say, this is our opportunity to create a clean, green, sustainable island for our future and for our children's future. We do that by harnessing our renewable energies, which are an abundant source. We have an ability to be energy independent, which is why I'm chair of Oireachtas. I want to try and amplify that message into decision makers and explain how we actually are. But to get that implementation, we need to deploy proven technologies at scale and at pace. And that requires detailed discussions in the detail of what the obstacles are. And so that requires regular engagement. So I don't think we have an issue, to summarize, I don't think we have an issue with policy, the policy framework, the legislative framework, the regulatory frameworks that all stack together at EU or domestic level. What we have is hard work to do, very urgently, almost by month, on implementation and on removing the blockages. And simultaneously, to serve the political class, we need to have a narrative that brings the populace with you, that explains to citizens, this is the golden opportunity. This is the time now, this next decade is the time to do this. And it's in the actions you take today and tomorrow. And here's why. And here's why it's really easy. And we're going to make it easy for you to do that. I would say there's a couple of constituent parts to that.
Absolutely. And, when you're saying, like, in terms of Brian's mandate to represent the constituents, mm-hmm. and a number of the points you raised is that nobody can be left behind here, mm-hmm. right? Absolutely not. So it's mm-hmm. key then when EU policies are formulated, that there's an element of respecting local considerations. Mm-hmm. And can you take us through, obviously we rely upon policy mm-hmm. To look out for us in the long term, mm-hmm. Around the corners that we can't see in terms of what's coming. So from your experience, can mm-hmm. you give us some insights into that the methodology mm-hmm. behind policy formulation and how it makes its way down to implementation?
Oh, okay. So sure, it depends on the sector that you're talking about, but in many large respects, and particularly around climate, the EU has competency under the treaties to generate policy in this space. And so what often happens very simply is the European Commission will produce a policy document for discussion, a policy paper, and then that's that's refined, and then they bring it into the Council of Ministers. The Council of Ministers discuss it, and if there's an agreement on a policy proposal and there's a need for legislation, you get into a tripartite arrangement with the Parliament, the Council, and the European Commission. And all of that allows for, it depends on the policy area, depends on the particular issue. It's quite a sophisticated and complex kind of ecosystem, but it does produce at the end of it laws which have direct effect. There are regulations and also implementing and delegated acts under the comitology procedures. And then you also have these directives, which are the kind of the broader hangers, if you like, that they hand to the states and say, you can hang whatever clothes you like on that and make, but that's the shape of it. That's what we want you to have, but you can dress it effectively. You can tailor it to your own member state, because remember, Europe is very diverse. We stretch from Malta all the way to the Nordics. And so in east to west, the geography that we're covering, the kind of societies that we're governing, they are very, very diverse. So subsidiarity is a core principle of the EU system. But in this space, what I think is really interesting, I would observe a trend in a tightening and a greater use of, I don't know, Brian, would you agree, the greater use of the kind of the measures, the legislative measures that have almost immediate and more direct effect, particularly around energy security and achieving net zero. And this is where I think the war in Ukraine has triggered that response. It has marshalled the member states around major decisions which would never have occurred, like switching off Russian gas, switching off Russian oil. And the consequence of that is it's going to bring a lot of political pain because it's going to cause rationing, and that's going to be felt in everybody's house. But that, to me, ratchets up the need to get faster about cleaner, greener solutions. So it's this balancing. How do you inflict pain knowingly, because it's the right thing to do from a foreign policy perspective, but you actually have to, you have to give people hope. You have to keep them secure with their light and heating and their transport opportunities. So I think actually it's a very rare set of circumstances we have right now. And I don't think we need more policy or legislation. It's coming at a rate of knots out of every announcement from Brussels that you're hearing every day on the news. We need mechanisms for implementation.
Just to pick up on that, I find that really interesting. And Tanya knows a hell of a lot more about how the EU works than I do. And it's interesting to hear that, like, you feel that the mechanisms that are there are actually suited already to, what we need. Even in this situation of a war in Europe, mm-hmm. and you're right, and like the evidence of the last few months is that Europe has actually held together very tight. There's been strong consensus around huge decisions. It's mm-hmm. really quite amazing. My fear would have been that the mechanisms aren't there and you get some kind of, like member states going in different directions and lack of cohesion and, ultimately a threat to the European project as well. Mm-hmm. We're not seeing that actually. And, thankfully. Mm-hmm. I'm also interested in that, this idea that, Paddy, you asked, do the processes need to change? And I think, you change the process of democracy at your peril, because the knock-on effect of that, or the unintended consequence of that, could be actually very bad. But perhaps what we don't often do is engage as many people as we should in a lot of the decisions that we take. And there are exceptions to that we can see that worked. And the Citizens' Assembly is a really good example from, 5 years ago now? Mm. Like, the Citizens' Assembly was in many ways a cop-out by the government of the time. It was, we'll hand this really hard decision to 100 randomly selected people and let them tell us what's important. And they did. And they said we need to cut emissions at, I think 7.6% per year through to 2030. And there's a direct line from the work that they did through to the Programme for Government and the 51% cut. And I can't see that we would have got that agreement. Now we're still in target land, we have to move beyond that. But we also wouldn't have those targets if we didn't have that level of engagement. And it seems to me that for the implementation of a lot of the policies that follow on from the targets, and actually this was confirmed to me yesterday in the committee when we had the Local Government Management Association in, and various representatives of the local authority system, where a lot of climate action is channeled through, whether it's transport or housing, and so many things go through our local government system. And they said it can't be all top down. It has to be bottom up as well. You have to figure out how to engage at the local level with people so that they're part of the decision-making process and feel that it's fair, that they've been considered. And what I took from that is that if you don't do that, actually, you're probably not going to succeed.
In terms of looking at change, certainly wouldn't be looking at changing democracies, the core principles of democracy. It's more around, even access to information, key access to information, and those who are operating in industry, be it regardless of what that industry is, be it if it was medical industry for medical, if we're looking at health, etc., or the energy industry if we're looking at energy. And I guess if we look at people, stakeholders we would have spoken to throughout this series, they are several steps away from decision makers in government. They would like better access to government. And I'd anticipate that also government and government ministers would also like better access to that expertise. Because if you look at it at the moment, you might ministers' advisors, the regulators, then you'll have your key stakeholders like EirGrid, and they will form committees with stakeholders. And that's a kind of, there's a lot of links there between, as opposed to kind of getting better access. But you, Brian, with the Oireachtas Committee on Climate Change, you brought a number of energy market stakeholders to the table to represent directly to government. And how did you find that experience? Did it help to enlighten people on the topics? And is that something that could perhaps be built on to provide a better link between industry and government going forward?
Yeah, I think, and what we did wasn't particularly unusual. That's what the committee system is there for. But I think, I would say this, but I think it's a particularly serious and hardworking committee, and they're trying to figure out the solution to the challenge that we have. And I'm on a number of committees, but I don't see on the other ones the level of attendance. So often what happens in committees, because politicians obviously are very time limited, they'll pop into a committee, ask a question, and they're gone to some other committee. In the climate one, they're there for 3-4 hours every week, listening. Even if they're not asking questions, they're listening, and I think that's very reassuring, actually. But I think we can do more of it, certainly, and we will. And as I said, I think the latter half of this year, we are going to really get stuck into this communications challenge. How do we bring that information, sell that opportunity, examine the role of the media in conveying the message. Is it conveying the message? We know from the UK from 10 or 12 years ago, I think it was the Stern report, was it, that looked at how the media was communicating the challenge of climate change, and it was a really cold, hard, uncomfortable look, and it did lead to changes in how the media conveyed the message. So anyway, that's what we're going to spend a bit of time on, and and we will go back to industry and give them a platform. But we do see the role of the committee as a way of pressuring government, getting that information to government so that it makes the right decisions, and airing some of the challenges and the solutions to the wider public via the media that report on the committee work.
When we look at what was achieved when we identified the crisis that was COVID, and now as we identify the crisis that we're in the middle of with the war in Ukraine, it's extraordinary to see what can be achieved when you identify it as a crisis. And the challenge with the energy crisis outside of the war in Ukraine is that it's a crisis with an invisible cloak. And do we need to start changing the mechanisms that treat this like a crisis so that, for example, that we have an equivalent of NEFIT for energy that brings together a kind of a body of people, a body of industry experts that will be able to provide government with a succinct suite of options that will be collectively brought together by key experts that we have in Ireland.
First, I wanted to compliment Brian on the work of the Joint Oireachtas Committee. It has been a phenomenal curation of input, and it's a really valuable report. When it's produced, I think it's still to be produced, but when that's produced, that's a very valuable record. And I think, to your point about what are the teams and processes that we put in place, it's effectively what we're talking about. I think there's a couple of things. In terms of access to decision makers, it's natural and normal for ministers to rely on their advisors. And I would say what you describe is not so much links or distant steps, but it's an ecosystem. The state owns many of its semi-states and it expects input from them. But what I think you're thinking through is how does the broader collective set of expertise, be that from industry or academia or from civil society, how is that harnessed? And it's a really important part of building that narrative for government. I would say that most recently the Minister, Ryan, ran a stakeholder forum in Dublin Castle. That was a very well attended and well represented in its attendance of society along thematic areas that needed sort of suggestions for next steps. I think a kind of a frequent structured approach using that kind of forum enables transparent input into the democratic process. So that is something I would say should be strengthened and made as a permanent feature of our deliberation. I think, the NEFIT idea is very attractive in the sense that what you're looking for really is data scientists and those who understand the opportunities, the science, the engineering, the environmental science, the politics, the policy. You collect those people and they offer their data-driven analysis to government, who have to make decisions and based on the recommendations that they're seeing. The really interesting thing for me about NEFIT was there was daily communication of the landscape, if you like. You could see up and down how we were performing. Now, public health pandemic affects individuals immediately, and climate is no different. But will this be? Could you replicate it exactly? Would the crisis be so compressed that you could actually run something with that daily set of briefings? Probably not exactly. But I do think what was really interesting that I would try to harness from NEFIT was that there was a full Taoiseach-led cross-government collaboration. So all the key departments met on an almost daily basis, I assume, inside government. When I was in government and it was previous crises, there was daily meetings on these kind of things. So it forces those relationships, not forces them, but it encourages the opportunity for them to be there. Those relationships get made. People start thinking together around solutions and then bringing in the scientific community. And I would argue industry, who are basically the scientists of the engineering of this, that actually informed the thinking. And that is something we should do. There's still a sort of a siloed approach to, enterprises looking after potentially the enterprise options around offshore renewables, and DEC is looking after energy security and renewables, and EirGrid's out doing whatever. And they themselves meet together, but there isn't a forum that gathers input from industry into them for decision making at government level. And I do think a cross-government kind of climate crisis committee or some sort of such thing chaired by the Taoiseach would be very beneficial.
Absolutely agree. And I certainly don't think we'd necessarily want to look to the semi-states always as the guiding light in this regard.
Yeah.
I certainly think that even with certain activity from semi-state participation in the electricity market and otherwise highlights that there are vested interests and that don't necessarily act in the best interest of Ireland Inc.
This is true. And I suppose the state always needs to be mindful of sort of the competition issues. And I think really by the point, if I can clarify that point, what I mean by that is EirGrid as TSO is the state appointed TSO. And so there is a direct relationship because it's owned by the state, but also because it operates the system. But that's not to say that the engagement should be exclusively with EirGrid, and it shouldn't be that. If it is that, there's something really wrong.
When we look at EU policies, becoming effective in national implementation plans. How are they monitored, measured, and is the methodology for monitoring and measurement, is it as effective as it needs to be, or is that an area also for improvement?
Yeah. So one part of the last clean energy package that came out of the EU was the energy governance framework, and what that instituted was each member state had to prepare a national energy and climate plan, which basically set out how that member state was working towards the achievement of the agreed legislative targets that it had adopted from EU policy into national policy, or within national policy they may have wanted to even exceed those EU targets. But it's what that instrument does is it allows public administration at EU level to slide rule the 27. So you can very quickly see where the outliers are on what issues. And then that does a couple of things. It allows for a monitoring and a reporting and a compliance framework. And it also allows policymakers to review what is particularly problematic. So, for example, I noticed today, just in preparing for this, the EU repowering package has specifically called out the need to generate these renewable go-to areas, which they determine are areas that there are particular planning processes that will be parked or accelerated to facilitate the deployment of renewable energy. Now that learning can only come from evidence that's generated biannually by the member states and reviewed by the Commission with an assessment report to both pursue those that are errant and need to be brought into compliance, but also to inform future policy making. So policy making is a cycle. So it says, okay, well, where do we need to go next? What's the learning out of this? So I think that's generally how states report on their climate objectives. They also have to report domestically to their own parliaments, which Brian is in the hot seat on. Yeah.
Yep.
So
I'm still learning on that steep curve still.
So we even though we're talking about policy, large scale changes, etc., the whole purpose of all of this, and we can never lose sight of it, is to improve the quality of life for all Irish citizens. And that has to be at the top. That is at the top of everything. It has to be at the top, and we need to demonstrate it as such. And when we look in this regard, I guess, speaking with Conal Bulger, a point he made was that perhaps large grid scale solar is more effective than small scale residential solar. But small scale residential solar is very important because it empowers people. It brings people on the journey. And it's also, he referred to it effectively like the gateway drug for getting people involved. And that's absolutely key to this going forward. People need to see how it not only directly affects them, but how they are part of this journey, because that is what we're setting out to achieve, is an improvement of quality of life for everybody. When we look at that, some of the mechanisms that are in place at the moment around, I spoke earlier about, you really are in the lucky few if you can fund the portion of the asset cost that it is to actually increase the energy performance of your house. The majority of people aren't living in houses that were built in the last 10 years. So there's a considerable undertaking there for us to actually make that shift. And as well as what can be achieved from an energy perspective, from the energy performance of those houses, that helps us to achieve in terms of the buy-in, bringing people along on the journey, highlighting to them that this is a journey and you've just seen the beginning of the benefits in terms of your warmer home, your more comfortable living there. Do you have any thoughts, Brian, on how we can help to better finance some of these upgrades so that it is more accessible to everybody? Because the knock-on benefit isn't just a warmer house for that person. It's national buy-in to a renewable energy program.
We have evidence from the Warmer Home Scheme, which is the retrofit scheme for social homes, that they have people living in these homes, their lives have been vastly improved, both in terms of their energy costs, the air quality, and there's really positive health outcomes as well as economic. And the evidence is that when one street is done, the other street really demands to be done as well. And that's really positive, so when it's so patently clear what the positive outcome is, then you start to get the buy-in and you get the pressure on the system, which is good. Now, the there is huge pressure there, and it's coming from government. It's 500,000 houses up to retrofit them to B2 standard by 2030. It's really a huge challenge, probably the biggest infrastructural challenge the state has ever undertaken. And there's going to be all kinds of problems with that, like where do we get the people who are going to do the work? Where are they going to live? How do we develop the ecosystem of companies and contractors that are going to do the work? And then another challenge is how are some people and many people going to afford the retrofit? And there are very generous grants, and obviously the carbon tax is hypothecated as the word we use. About 5 billion in the revenue of that is basically goes towards grants for all kinds of both deep and shallow retrofit measures. But for many people, there's still a gap. You're talking about anything between 30 and 50,000, maybe more even for some houses. So even if you're getting a 50% grant, you might have to put up 20 or 25,000 euros. Now, what is coming in the next few months is the low cost loans. So these are backed by the European Investment Bank. People are going to be able they'll get the 50% grant, and then they'll be able to go to the credit union or the one-stop shop to get the low-cost loan. And they'll be paying back that loan essentially with savings on their energy bills for whatever, 7-10 years. So that is a very positive step. And inevitably, there's still going to be people who can't get the loans and they're going to be outside the system. But and we will have to refine policy year on year to try and capture those people and bring them into the net and ultimately get to the 500,000. And it's one of the strong features actually of the Climate Act is that the Climate Action Plan, which is the Act mandates, is revisable annually. So if we're not on track, then more measures, more creative solutions are required. So, or if they are required, then they can be put into the plan on a yearly basis. So I think, and the evidence we have is that there has been a pretty good uptake, and SEAI tell us that they are reasonably on target, with the plan. So ultimately, we want to get to those 500,000 houses. We want to get to 1.5 million houses by the 2040s. This is a huge challenge, but it's a huge opportunity as well. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of people who are in school now who probably should be looking to that industry as a career. Yeah. There's certainly good careers to be made in retrofitting.
I could add to that if you like. There's sort of two things for me. The first is just at the domestic level, and I work for An Post at the moment. So but one of the things we've done is we've put together that package of a green loan. We've also developed what we call our green hubs. You may the jumper with going over the house. Angela Scanlon is our ambassador on that. The point is that we want to be able to go into a very local post office, put in your BRR rating, get it, and then get the suite of options, understand how much everything costs, put against that your grant, and then we'll provide the loan, and we do all the back end kind of pain points. So that's something that we have developed to support customers in accessing affordable loans. And I think I would just also sort of applaud the ambition and the scale of funding that the government has put towards retrofitting. It's a seismic step forward, and it's hugely ambitious, and it'll take everything to put the skill sets in place that can actually meet the demand that's going to come at it. So I would welcome that. The other aspect of financing that I just might add is the sort of economy-wide climate-led investment. And this is really to what are the global funds doing? Who are they backing? Who are they investing in? And I think there's a lot of focus in all of these discussions around sustainability and clean energy, around proven technologies, the stuff that we know how to do. But if you imagine that the Earth has, a blanket of carbon around it, and 50% of those emissions are targeted through these proven technologies, so solar, battery, wind, but 50% aren't. And so retrofitting, built fabrics, cement, aluminum production, heavy goods vehicles, public mobility, decarbonising these hard to abate sectors has to happen in parallel. We need to attract climate-led investment into these areas. to decarbonise them, because they are the economy-wide infrastructures that support decarbonisation. So it isn't, it's just sometimes I think sometimes in the conversations around clean energy, they can tend to focus on specifically around electricity or technologies that are prevalent in electricity generation or demand flexibility. Even that's a new step forward, and we need more demand management, not less. But I just think that we need to expand our thinking a little bit to those hard to abate sectors as well, because they need to be happening in parallel.
That's actually where some of this discussion in previous episodes went to is how do we focus so much on electricity? And again, I don't think it's just because I'm in the sector that I do, but I think that we do focus a huge amount on electricity, but there's a hugely broader range of challenges to be dealt with. And this is where I think, we talk about system thinking and the need for system thinking now at a level that we've never exercised before. So at one point we spoke with David Connolly and Donna Gartland, who were looking at decarbonising heat. And let's say Donna would be very much focusing on district heating networks, etc., and David on the likes of heat pumps, etc. But if we look at David's ambition to install a heat pump, it's only worthwhile doing if there's higher levels of renewables on the power system. So then that brings us to our discussion with Noel and Connell, talking about their struggles and what they need to bring higher levels of renewable energy onto the power system. And they need the continued investment signals, and they also need a power system that's able to operate with higher levels of renewables. That then brings us on to our storage and hydrogen discussion, which is talking about that there aren't appropriate incentives for the types of storage that are needed to appropriately facilitate the renewable energy coming on board. And then you need to change like the market incentives, etc. So when we look at that, and that's just the energy sector, as the electricity sector, for David Connolly to put in a heat pump, to convince a customer to put in a heat pump and the rationale behind it, all of this has to work and work really well. So we were previously able to focus on largely single issues. We were supplementing renewable energy, and now we're not. We have to become dependent on it. But also beyond energy, we need to look at communities. So historically, I think in Ireland, we have developed plans around accommodating people as opposed to building communities. And I'd be keen to get your thoughts as to how that needs to change, and that we firmly bring energy into the mix, but energy is going to be only part of that. Energy, education, social amenities, etc. And how you feel that there needs to be a change in terms of how Ireland approaches the building of communities. Because that, again, we're back to the quality of life for everybody in Ireland. Energy plays a role in that. And it's it highly demonstrates that system thinking approach that's needed. That would have been your background as an engineer, Brian.
Yeah. Well, the planning piece is huge. And by that, I mean, where we locate people to live, to work, and so on. We haven't done that particularly well. And actually, it's probably cheap energy has, undermined the need for good planning in the last century, probably. So, it became easy to live very, very far away from, where you went to work or school or whatever. So we didn't, get particularly good, or we actually probably abandoned many of the principles of good planning that were there actually before that. If you think back to the 19th century, the Victorians at the time were very good planners, and a lot of that was to do with the fact that they had to be, they had to create places where these workers of the new industrial revolution lived together and could live together in, happiness and harmony and raise families and so on. Yeah, and cheap energy probably undermined our efforts at good planning in the 20th century. And we have to reverse that. And that's really hard because physical change is very, very real physical changes have been made to our country and our urban areas and ex-urban areas. And there is a change, there has been a change in the last few years in a recognition that it makes sense to promote living in the village and in the town and in the city as well. And in my mind, you have to promote it and you have to encourage it rather than tell people they need to live in these places. You have to say, provide these services and amenities, everything that a family or an elderly person or a young person might need. So they will want to live in that place, and so that they genuinely have everything on their doorstep within 5 or 10 or 15 minutes. That's where we need to get to. And we're actually quite a long way from that. We're probably moving in the right direction now. We talk about compact growth, which is really about not building in all these greenfield sites and instead, recognizing that we have an urban footprint and an underutilized urban footprint in most of our urban areas, and to build on those and to make use of those. But I think it's something we haven't properly embraced, and there's a very direct connection between our carbon emissions and planning. So, if you live in a car-dependent society, you're contributing to that 20% of Ireland's total national emissions, which is huge. So we do talk about renewable energy in the electricity sector a lot, and we do tend to turn a blind eye to actually a bigger proportion of our emissions is caused by how we move around the place. And I don't think electric vehicles are they're certainly not a magic bullet, but they're not the best solution for those transport emissions. A better solution where we actually develop communities and societies where there's a high quality of life and a better quality of life than people currently have is actually to get people living back in the towns and cities, give them everything they need, give them a reason to live in these places, and make the idea of living in this distant suburb or the one-off house maybe, just make that the unappealing choice.
Yeah. I mean, I would add to that. I think that, if anything has come out of the pandemic, the silver lining has been a connection to our biodiversity. It's what people crave. It's why we go on holidays. We're looking for access to nature and to the sea and to forests and to walks and to time with family. So, and I think that's something that feeds a kind of that narrative, that idea. This is the selling point. This is the green, clean, secure island that we can have. This is your connection to the beautiful nature that's around you and your geographic sort of closeness to that. To give that practical effect, I think that you need to have that idea. You need actors in place. Those actors tend to be those that form government and make decisions, but also those that inform government and are part of civil society. And then I think you need the institutions and processes that help get over the blockages. And this is where we have our systems of public administration. I think just a tangential point, but slightly related, is we are interconnected in energy physically across islands, the islands of Ireland and Great Britain, and the northwestern Europe. And I think there's a need to think kind of institutionally about how we govern that. So we need regional energy governance is what I would suggest on that. But I think domestically we have opportunities here. We have a lot of will, a lot of skill, a lot of expertise, a lot of opportunity to get together to drive this forward. So I think that there's very small changes that I'd make. Actually, I would institute the ministerial process. I would engender hope and a connection to our biodiversity as the core narrative. I would look to kind of use the tools that Europe are giving us to consolidate and fast track the deployment of proven technologies. And I would look to the global system of financing to bring in that financing for climate-led investment for those really hard to abate sectors. I'm extremely hopeful for the next decade. Actually, I do think if we decelerate or keep our eye off the ball, we're gonna lose it. But it's why we're all here. It's why you've gotten the response that you have. There is an extraordinary swell of support for Ireland to do this, and I'm very hopeful for that.
I really like the point about biodiversity and hanging on that.
Yeah,
I think it is fundamental to us to want to be in nature and to enjoy it, and we are part of nature.
Yes.
And if we lean into that, and even if I think we talked about communities, creating communities, the happier and the healthier towns and cities are the ones that have the parks and the greenery and the rivers, and and so I suppose in our headlock effort to get people living in towns and villages, we have to be mindful to actually that natural amenity and biodiversity need that everybody has, and
I think is the key to unlocking broader political support, actually.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. And yeah, we kind of treat climate and biodiversity as
Separate things.
separate but related, but maybe we don't appreciate just how related they are. Yeah, and
or even biodiversity as a first lens,
Yeah.
And then to protect that and sustain it, protect it in the first instance, and then to remediate it. You actually have to take the carbon out of the environment. Yeah, I think people are very naturally drawn to that opportunity. Yeah,
I think we could continue to talk about this all day, but I think that's a fantastic point to wrap it up on.
Okay.
So Tanya, Brian, thank you very much for your time. It's been very enlightening.
Pleasure,
Thank you.
Paddy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.